The house on Broccoli Drive slept under a calm, late autumn darkness, the kind of silence suburban neighborhoods take for granted. Inside, the Delmar home looked ordinary suit jackets still hanging on hooks, veterinary journals stacked neatly on the table, framed family photos watching over the hallway. But somewhere between midnight and dawn, investigators would later say, another presence moved through the house. A quiet shape crossing the carpet. A tool lifted from the garage. A shadow carrying it down the hall toward the master bedroom where Peter and Joan Porco slept, unaware that the person entering their doorway had once called them the backbone of his world. The family, from the outside, was what suburban comfort is built on. Peter Porco, a respected appellate court clerk, well known for his discipline and work ethic. Joan, a warm, dedicated school speech pathologist who poured herself into helping children speak and read. Their sons, Jonathan and Christopher, raised with structure, opportunity, and expectation. In Delmar, the Porcos were what neighbors pointed to when describing a stable, close-knit family. Their younger son, Christopher, was away at college in Rochester, studying to become a veterinarian. A bright future, a supportive home, and a son who called to check in at least. That was the image everyone saw. Just after dawn on November 14th, 2004, the image shattered. A courthouse colleague grew worried when Peter failed to show up for work, an absence so uncharacteristic it felt like a shout. Officers were sent to check the home. When they arrived, the front door was ajar. Newspapers littered the entry, and the alarm system, usually armed, hung silent. The officers stepped inside and were immediately struck by the stillness, a wrong kind of quiet. Then they saw Peter. He was lying at the base of the staircase, barely alive, grievously wounded. His head injuries were catastrophic, yet somehow, in a feat that would later puzzle medical experts, he had moved through parts of the house after the attack, turning off lights, attempting routine tasks his brain could no longer fully understand. The scene around him was chaos, blood where it shouldn't be, furniture askew, and no signs of forced entry. Upstairs, Joan was found in the bedroom, miraculously still alive but critically injured, unable to speak. Detectives described her survival as both astonishing and heartbreaking. News spread fast. Christopher, the away-at-college son, rushed home, distraught and devastated. A community comforted him, imagining what it must be like to lose a father and nearly lose a mother in the same morning. He hugged neighbors, leaned into reporters' microphones, and thanked law enforcement for their efforts. He looked like a grieving child who had just lost everything. But detectives weren't so certain. The house told a different story. The alarm system logs didn't match the narrative of an unknown intruder. The broken basement window appeared staged, glass resting on top of items instead of beneath them. Financial notes emerged warnings about forged signatures, unpaid loans, and parental frustration over missing equipment. The case, once thought to be a random act of brutality, now had hints of planning and motive. And then came the detail that shook the investigation. At the hospital, barely conscious and barely able to move, Joan was asked by a detective whether Christopher had attacked her. According to the nurse present, she nodded. A faint, fragile gesture, but one that immediately became the center of every conversation in the war room. Prosecutors would later argue it was a mother's final moment of clarity. Defense attorneys would call it an involuntary movement, a misinterpretation born from chaos and trauma. But in that moment, inside the hospital room, nothing felt ambiguous. A survivor had spoken, if only for a second. By the end of the first 48 hours, the portrait of the perfect son was beginning to blur. Surveillance footage showed a yellow Jeep similar to Christopher's crossing toll booths at suspicious times. Campus witnesses recalled seeing him near his dorm at hours that contradicted his claims. A laptop, normally kept in his room, had vanished. Financial tensions between son and parents, once whispered about, now filled binders on detectives' desks. Still, uncertainty lingered. There was no blood on his clothes, no direct physical evidence placing him in the home during the attack. A mother, clinging to life, had given a nod, but would later say she remembered nothing. A father, known for kindness, lay dead with no final words to offer clarity. And Christopher continued to maintain his innocence with unwavering calm. As investigators left the hospital that day, they were struck by one truth. Nothing about the Porco's picture-perfect life made sense anymore. The house had been a sanctuary. Now it was a battleground between memory and evidence, love and betrayal, and the one person who could solve the mystery and perhaps had caused it stood in the spotlight, calm, composed, and insisting he had nothing to hide. The courtroom was silent, except for the soft shuffle of papers and the steady hum of air conditioning. At the center of it all sat Christopher Porco, clean-cut, composed, dressed in tailored suits that made him look less like a murder suspect and more like the polished college student he claimed to be. Jurors watched him closely, but they were watching something else even more carefully. The nurse, who took the stand to repeat one of the most haunting moments of the entire investigation. She described the hospital scene, the question detectives asked the critically injured Joan Porco, and the small but unmistakable nod she gave when asked if her son had attacked her. A gesture that would ignite national debate. A gesture that Porco's defense insisted was meaningless. The prosecution began by dismantling the image Christopher had built for himself. They presented toll booth records showing a yellow Jeep matching Christopher's passing through key checkpoints in the hours before the attack. Surveillance timestamps aligned too precisely with the window when investigators believed the killer traveled from Rochester to Delmar. Cell phone pings, computer logins, and ATM footage formed a timeline that contradicted every part of Christopher's alibi. Prosecutors described it as a digital trail the defendant could not erase. Then came the staged break-in. Crime scene photographs revealed details only a trained investigator would notice. Broken glass strewn on top of debris instead of beneath it. A cut screen so clean it looked more like a theatrical prop than the desperate work of an intruder. A missing laptop that fit too neatly into a story about outside attackers. Forensic experts testified that the so-called burglary had the hallmarks of careful performance, not chaos. Prosecutors dug deeper. They brought up financial tensions between Christopher and his parents. Stolen checks, forged signatures, unpaid debts, and attempts to tap into his parents' savings. Witnesses in the banking and veterinary school communities testified about money disputes and disciplinary concerns. A portrait emerged, not of a hard-working student, but of a young man quietly drowning in lies, debt, and expectations. One who had both motive and opportunity. Yet the defense fought back with equal intensity. They pointed to the lack of physical evidence, no blood on Christopher, no weapon linking directly to him, and no eyewitness placing him inside the home. They reminded jurors that Joan, the victim who survived, later stated she did not remember accusing her son. They argued the nod was nothing more than an involuntary reflex from a woman in medical crisis. They highlighted the loving bond between mother and son, suggesting she would never protect him if she believed he was guilty. Their strategy hinged on emotion as much as logic. A devoted son rushing home to tragedy, a family known for kindness, a surviving mother who publicly declared her support for Christopher and sat behind him in court with quiet loyalty. Defense attorneys portrayed the prosecution's circumstantial case as a web woven from assumptions, built on the idea that a successful student would suddenly turn into a nighttime intruder armed with an axe-like tool. But piece by piece, the prosecution tightened the narrative. They revealed how Christopher had used his computer in ways that suggested preparation. They replayed campus sightings from the night of the attack, witnesses recalling his Jeep heading out onto the road hours before dawn. They presented records showing he disabled the family alarm using his personal code, a detail no intruder could have known. They showed toll slips, gas purchases, and phone inactivity that aligned perfectly with a round trip to Delmar. It was a story in which every small lie supported the larger one. The jurors listened as expert after expert took the stand. A ballistics specialist testified about the attack trajectory. A forensic pathologist spoke about the nature of the wounds and the brutal force used. A detective described how the house felt staged to the point of theatricality. The prosecution's argument became a mosaic, no one piece proving guilt, but all pieces together, forming a picture too detailed to ignore. Closing arguments were a clash of two worlds. The defense insisted Christopher was the loyal son he appeared to be. The prosecution countered that he was a young man who killed the very people who gave him everything, then attempted to erase the evidence with meticulous planning. The jury deliberated and returned with a verdict that echoed across the state of New York. Guilty on all counts. Christopher Porco was sentenced to 25 years to life for each charge, a punishment reflecting the savage betrayal prosecutors described. But the emotional aftermath was even more haunting. Joan Porco, the woman who survived one of the most brutal domestic attacks in modern New York history, continued to stand by her son, insisting he was innocent. Her presence in the courtroom became one of the case's most tragic contradictions, a mother defending the man whom investigators and jurors believed tried to kill her. As Christopher was led away in handcuffs, the courtroom watched a family fracture that could never fully heal. A father gone, a mother scarred forever, and a son imprisoned for the rest of his adulthood. The house on Broccoli Drive remains quiet, but the shadows of that night still linger, proof that sometimes the most terrifying figure is not the stranger in the dark, but the one who wears the face of someone you love. The trailer sat alone on a patch of rural Royce City land, the kind of Texas darkness that swallows everything once the sun slips behind the pastures. No street lamps, no traffic, just silence and the hum of insects. When sheriff's deputies pulled up that October night, their headlights carved through the stillness, revealing a home that looked perfectly undisturbed from the outside. But the moment officers stepped through the doorway, that stillness collapsed into one of the most unsettling double homicides in modern Texas memory. Inside, Dennis and Norma Woodruff lay dead, attacked with a combination of stabbing and shooting, so contradictory that detectives later described the scene as chaotic but calculated. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of a burglary, no ransacked drawers, no broken locks. Whatever happened inside those walls seemed personal, immediate, close. The Woodruffs were well-liked, hard-working, and deeply rooted in the rural community. Dennis repaired machinery. Norma worked with livestock and kept the household running. Their son, Brandon, just 18, was away at college, splitting time between school, friends, and a party-heavy social life. To neighbors, Brandon was charismatic, good-looking, and full of potential. To his parents, he was their pride and their worry, a teenager moving fast in a world they didn't fully understand. But when investigators began the slow, meticulous reconstruction of the final hours before the murders, Brandon's name kept appearing in places they could not ignore. He was the last known person to see his parents alive that Sunday evening. Phone records showed patterns that didn't align neatly with his timeline. His drives between school, Dallas nightlife, and the rural family home raised questions about opportunity and motive. Still, nothing about the Woodruff case was straightforward. The crime scene told a confusing story. No clear murder weapon was found. The combination of gunfire and knife wounds made the attack look fragmented. Blood patterns suggested movement and struggle, yet investigators could not determine the exact path of the killer. Detectives publicly stated they believed the attacker had been close to the victims, someone who entered the home willingly, without fear. At first, attention focused on potential outsiders, disgruntled acquaintances, theft-motivated strangers, even theories involving criminal passers-by. But each lead crumbled under scrutiny. Security camera footage and rural traffic records were sparse. No vehicle sightings matched a stranger narrative. No stolen items suggested robbery. It was as though the violence originated from inside the family circle. Meanwhile, Brandon's behavior after the murders raised eyebrows among friends and investigators. He attended parties, went out dancing, and according to witness testimony, displayed an emotional flatness that some described as alarming. Others argued it was the shock response of a teenager who didn't know how to process trauma. His social life, including newly emerging details about his sexuality, became a major talking point in the case, something critics later condemned as deeply prejudicial. Investigators tracked his movements in the hours before and after the killings. There were quiet gaps in the timeline periods in which his phone was off or unaccounted for. The Jeep he drove that weekend became the subject of intense forensic scrutiny. Witness statements conflicted. Some friends remembered seeing him at certain times. Others recalled him arriving earlier or later than he claimed. Each small inconsistency became a puzzle piece. But the most debated element came from law enforcement themselves. The prosecutors formed their narrative long before all evidence was conclusive. They believed Brandon killed his parents after disagreements over money, school, and independence. Critics argued the case was built on character judgments rather than hard physical evidence. By mid-investigation, the community was split. Some residents believed Brandon was targeted as the easy suspect. Others insisted the brutality pointed directly to someone with close emotional ties to the victims. Rumors spread about lifestyle conflicts, hidden resentments, and private arguments inside the Woodruff home. Rumors never fully confirmed, but often repeated. Late in the night, after days of interviews, deputies quietly voiced what many feared. The case was turning inward. The last person to see Dennis and Norma alive was now the primary person detectives needed to question more aggressively. In the glow of the sheriff's office hallway, investigators pinned timelines to a whiteboard, phone logs, travel windows, friend sightings, ATM withdrawals, gas receipts. The pattern wasn't perfect, but it was enough to raise suspicion. Part 3 ends with a single unresolved reality. The crime scene offered chaos. The timeline offered gaps, and the town offered whispers. And in the middle of all of it stood a college freshman, insisting he had nothing to do with the slaughter of the people who raised him, while the state of Texas quietly began building a case that would divide the public for decades. The jurors filed into their seats with the heavy quiet that only accompanies a case built almost entirely on inference. No murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, no blood-soaked clothing, no fingerprints tying the son to the scene. Yet the prosecution opened with absolute confidence, projecting an image of a killer hiding in plain sight, a young man who, they argued, lived a double life and silenced the only people who could expose it. In their telling, Brandon Woodruff wasn't the conflicted college freshman portrayed by his defense. He was a son spiraling financially, socially, and academically. They showed photographs taken after the murders. Brandon out with friends, dressed sharply, dancing under strobe lights just hours after his parents were found dead. The prosecution leaned on this contrast: two parents brutally killed in their quiet rural home, and a son who, according to witnesses, did not appear crushed by grief. Then they shifted to the timeline. Phone records showed Brandon moving between Dallas, school, and the Roy's city home in a pattern that prosecutors framed as opportunity. They emphasized gaps, windows of unaccounted time in which, they said, the murders could have occurred. Receipts, gas station footage, and statements from acquaintances were stitched together into a patchwork narrative. Not perfect, but suggestive. Forensics added tension, though not clarity. Experts testified about blood patterns and weapon possibilities, noting that the attack involved both stabbing and shooting. Prosecutors argued this suggested a crime fueled by emotion, not a random stranger's chaotic spree. They emphasized that there were no signs of forced entry. Whoever killed Dennis and Norma likely walked through the front door as if they belonged there. But when the defense rose, the courtroom felt the shift immediately. Their strategy was not to portray Brandon as saintly or flawless. It was to show that the state had built a life sentence on assumptions stacked precariously on top of one another. They reminded jurors again and again, no gun was ever recovered. No knife linked to Brandon. Not a drop of his DNA was found where the murder occurred. There were no bloody clothes seized, no confession, no definitive physical evidence tying him to the home at the moment of the attack. Then came the heart of the defense argument bias. They pointed to comments investigators allegedly made early in the case, referencing Brandon's sexuality, his social life, and his perceived double life. They argued that once detectives began seeing him through the lens of judgment rather than fact, tunnel vision took over. Innocent actions going out with friends, wearing clean clothes, acting stoic during grief, were reinterpreted as signs of guilt. The defense held up alibi fragments that the prosecution glossed over. Friends who placed him at parties when the murders might have occurred, witnesses who said they saw nothing suspicious, and the sheer difficulty of driving long distances, committing a double homicide, cleaning up, and returning to social life without leaving forensic traces. They also attacked the state's timeline aggressively. Many of the prosecution's key points were built on estimates, approximately, likely, probably, words that, the defense argued, had no place in a case where the stakes were life without parole. Then came one of the most memorable moments of the trial. A defense attorney held up the autopsy reports and said, quietly but clearly, that the Woodruff murders were so violent and so methodical that the killer should have been drenched in evidence. Yet Brandon was seen repeatedly that night in places where no one noticed blood, injuries, panic, or anything inconsistent with normal behavior. Either he is the most meticulous 18-year-old killer in Texas history, the lawyer said, or detectives followed the wrong story. Still, the prosecution pushed back hard. They pointed to Brandon's alleged inconsistencies, small shifts in his timeline, slight alterations in how he described the night. They emphasized motives rooted in money, rules, and lifestyle clashes. They argued that Brandon alone had the combination of access, opportunity, and emotional trigger. Closing arguments felt like two competing movies playing on the same screen. One side showed a young man whose life was spiraling who killed his parents to free himself. The other showed a teenager caught in a storm of circumstantial suspicion, buried by coincidence and community pressure. The jury deliberated for hours, then through the night. When they returned, they delivered a verdict that split opinion for years to come. Guilty of capital murder, life in prison without parole. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Some believed justice had been served. Others argued the state had punished a teenager for being different, for living fast, for not crying publicly. Documentaries soon followed. Legal advocacy groups picked up the case. Podcasts dissected the timeline. Innocence organizations questioned the evidence. Nearly 2 decades later, the Woodruff file remains one of the most argued Texas convictions of its era. A double homicide with no smoking gun. A jury convinced by circumstantial threads. A son still proclaiming he had nothing to do with the deaths of the people who raised him. Part 4 closes on a question that shadows the case even now. Was Brandon Woodruff a calculating killer who hid his crime behind a bright smile? Or a college kid swallowed by a narrative that grew larger than the facts could support? The fire crews thought it was just another abandoned car blaze, a routine call in the pre-dawn quiet of Melbourne's inner suburbs. The parklands were still dark, mist low over the grass, when firefighters arrived to douse the flames, swallowing a station wagon near the walking path. But as the smoke thinned and the heat lifted, one of the crew members stepped back, stunned. There were bodies inside. 2 of them, burned beyond recognition, positioned in a way that made seasoned officers uneasy. Whatever happened here had not been an accident. It had been deliberate, planned, and executed with chilling calm. Word spread quickly. Missing persons alerts were already circulating when detectives connected the burned vehicle to a prominent couple from Toorak, Margaret Wales King and her husband Paul King. They had vanished days earlier after leaving their elegant home for what was supposed to be a quiet evening walk. Margaret, the widowed daughter of a well-known philanthropist, was a fixture in Melbourne high society. Paul, her second husband, was gentle, reserved, and devoted to her. Their sudden disappearance had already rattled friends and media. But now, with the burned car, the truth began to harden into something darker. Police retraced the couple's final movements, studying security cameras, card activity, and calls between family members. A troubling detail emerged immediately. The last person to see them alive was Margaret's son, Matthew Wales, who had recently met with them that evening. To reporters, Matthew appeared devastated, soft-spoken, shaken, urging the public to help find the killers. Cameras captured him wiping his eyes, describing his parents as loving and irreplaceable. He spoke with polished grief. But detectives sensed cracks beneath the performance. The burned-out car suggested staging. The body's placement indicated they were moved there, post-mortem. Quietly, they began to focus on the home rather than the park. Behind the thick gates and manicured hedges of Margaret's property, investigators found inconsistencies, small items out of place, faint signs of a struggle, and an odd lack of forced entry. A stranger breaking into a wealthy couple's home to kill them, transport them unnoticed, and burn their vehicle. It didn't fit. What did fit was something investigators had seen in other cases. A family dynamic slowly corroding beneath wealth. Friends told detectives about long-standing financial tensions between Margaret and her son. Matthew had struggled for years, feeling overshadowed by the family's reputation and controlled by its generosity. He lived in the shadow of wealth that was never truly his. His resentment simmered quietly. His mother's financial decisions, inheritance plans, trust arrangements, support distributed unevenly, had grown into points of friction. Nothing explosive, nothing dramatic, just a slow accumulation of bitterness. The forensic team deepened the pressure. Patterns in the burn residue indicated accelerant. Tire marks near the park didn't match the couple's typical driving habits. Investigators reconstructed the timeline and realized the couple likely never made it to the park at all. Every new detail pulled the focus tighter around Matthew. Meanwhile, reporters camped outside his home. The public watched as he gave interviews, his voice calm, his grief neatly measured. But in the homicide unit, detectives charted his phone records, bank transactions, and movements. A picture formed of a man who had both opportunity and mounting motive. As officers continued searching Margaret's home, they discovered more forensic inconsistencies. The kind that quietly shifts suspicion from unknown intruders to someone with keys, familiarity, and emotional entanglement. Soon after, a breakthrough came. Forensic reconstruction suggested the couple had been attacked inside the house, then transported to the park inside their own vehicle. The violent events had been cleaned up carefully, almost ritualistically, but not perfectly. The case began to unravel around Matthew. Detectives noted his rigid posture in interviews, the way he seemed prepared rather than distraught. They examined financial documents revealing significant sums owed, debts hidden behind polite social interactions. Witnesses described years of tension, a complicated relationship marked by dependency and resentment. By the time forensic examiners submitted their full report, the scenario was unmistakable. The killings had not been committed by strangers looking for cash. They were committed by someone who knew the victims intimately, someone who wanted to erase them quickly and decisively. The part closes on the moment detectives finally confront Matthew with the forensic reconstruction showing that his parents were never abducted by unknown attackers. They were attacked at home, moved in their own car, and left burning in a quiet Melbourne park. The illusion of the grieving son was beginning to collapse. And the truth buried beneath family wealth, privilege, and obligation was starting to break through. The whiteboard in the homicide unit was crowded with arrows, dates, and forensic snapshots. At the center of it all was one name: Matthew Wales. Detectives had spent days reassembling the movements of Margaret Wales King and Paul King from the moment they left home until the moment firefighters found their bodies inside a burned vehicle. And every arrow, every timestamp, led back to their son, quietly at first. Then, unmistakably, investigators began by reconstructing the attack itself. According to forensic analysts, the injuries Margaret and Paul suffered suggested they were attacked inside the family home, not ambushed on a walk. The blood distribution, the marks on flooring, and the disrupted furniture patterns pointed to a sudden, violent assault delivered by someone they knew. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered locks, no broken windows. Whoever moved through the house that night did so freely, with the trust of those inside. By now, Matthew's public interviews, once viewed as raw grief, took on a different tone. Detectives replayed footage, the measured voice, the polished posture, the controlled emotion. Not proof, but something that didn't sit right. Behind closed doors, relatives whispered that tension between Matthew and his mother had been simmering for years. Arguments about finances, inheritance, and family obligations had grown sharper as Matthew's debts grew. Friends quietly admitted he often felt overshadowed by Margaret's social standing and frustrated by her decision-making power. Then came the forensic links that tightened the case. Trace particles found in the burned vehicle matched items from the house. Accelerant patterns inside the car suggested deliberate ignition rather than panic. Investigators noticed inconsistencies in Matthew's timeline. Moments he claimed to be elsewhere, contradicted by phone signals or witness recollections. Surveillance cameras captured his car in places he initially denied being. It wasn't a direct confession, but it was piece after piece after piece, narrowing the circle. When detectives brought him in for questioning, Matthew tried to maintain the calm he'd shown before the cameras. They asked about the evening of the couple's disappearance, the last supper shared with his mother and stepfather, and the hours that followed. He repeated his account carefully, insisting he had said goodbye before they left for their walk. But officers pressed on details: what he wore, what he did afterward, when he went to bed, who called him, whether he noticed anything unusual. Beneath the steady lighting of the interview room, small hesitations began to form. The breakthrough came from digital evidence. A sequence of phone movements placed him closer to the location where the burned car was found. Vehicle impressions near the park matched the Wales family station wagon. Purchases made earlier that week hinted at preparation items investigators believed were used to clean up the home and attempt to obscure the truth. These discoveries shattered the burned car narrative he had offered. What he described as a mysterious disappearance now read more like choreography. During a later interrogation, detectives revealed their reconstruction. Margaret and Paul were attacked inside the home. Their bodies were placed into the car. The vehicle was driven to the parklands under cover of darkness. It was set alight in a secluded area to erase evidence. Sitting across the table, Matthew's face remained controlled, but something behind the eyes shifted. He realized investigators were not fishing, they were presenting. Shortly afterward, the investigation hit its final turning point. Faced with mounting forensic evidence and pressure from every direction, Matthew Wales confessed. In a quiet, almost detached tone, he recounted the events of the night. He spoke of resentment, financial frustrations, and the overwhelming belief that he had been wronged by the family who supported him. The violence itself, he described with unsettling calm. His confession matched the forensic findings almost exactly. The courtroom phase followed swiftly. Prosecutors painted a portrait of entitlement turned deadly. They argued that Matthew saw his parents not as loved ones, but as obstacles standing between him and the life he imagined he deserved. The defense emphasized psychological strain, years of emotional build-up, and a man overwhelmed by perceived failure. But the confession, the forensics, and the betrayal at the core of the crime were undeniable. Matthew Wales was convicted and sentenced to a long prison term. The judge emphasized the calculated nature of the killings and the profound breach of trust, a son murdering not one but two devoted parents, then attempting to disguise the truth under flame and ash. The case left Australia stunned. A respected socialite couple had opened their lives and resources to their son, only to have that generosity repaid with violence. The burned car, once mysterious, became symbolic, a final attempt to erase a crime born not from desperation, but from resentment. The emotional kicker. In the end, the very man who sought to bury the truth beneath fire created one of the most unforgettable images in Australian criminal history. A charred vehicle in the early morning mist, holding the remains of two people who never imagined the danger living under their own roof. The scene at first looked tragically ordinary. A quiet bedroom, lights still off from the night before. A respected aviation businessman found lifeless in his bed. The gun resting near his hand suggested a self-inflicted shot. No overturned furniture, no signs of a break-in, no frantic struggle. Just the stillness of a home steeped in generational wealth and expectation. For nearly a decade, that stillness would disguise something far darker. Wayne Millard, founder and owner of Millard Air, had spent his life building a business brick by brick, hangar by hangar. He was the father who worked long hours, the man who dreamed of passing the aviation company to his son. And that son, Dellen Millard, was the heir everyone expected to inherit the sky. Wealthy, charismatic, and born into luxury, he lived a life that seemed paved for success. But beneath the polished image was a different truth. A pattern of manipulation, recklessness, and violence that would only be exposed years later. On the night Wayne died in 2012, police accepted the scene at face value. There were whispers of depression, hints of business struggles, and financial turbulence that seemed consistent with suicide. The investigation was brief. The case was closed. Dellen inherited the company, the assets, the estate. Friends recalled how strangely composed he seemed. Others noticed he moved quickly, almost too quickly, to take control of everything his father left behind. For most families, that moment would have been the end. For the Millards, it was only the first chapter, because in 2013, Dellen Millard would be arrested for two shocking murders. Tim Bosma, a Hamilton man lured by a test drive scam, and Laura Babcock, a missing Toronto woman whose disappearance had haunted investigators for years. Suddenly, the wealthy heir wasn't a golden son. He was a prime suspect in violent crimes that sent shockwaves across Canada. As homicide detectives pieced together the horrors of those cases, burned remains, hidden evidence, cryptic phone records, they began to revisit unresolved moments from Dellen's past. That included the night Wayne Millard died. The once accepted suicide now looked suspiciously convenient. Investigators reopened the file, pulling the old scene apart with fresh eyes. Forensics became the turning point. A new analysis of the entry wound suggested the angle did not match suicide. The position of the gun was inconsistent. Gunshot residue patterns didn't align with someone firing the weapon on themselves. And, most damning of all, the trajectory of the bullet indicated it could not have been self-inflicted the way the original report suggested. Detectives started examining family dynamics. Wayne was in the middle of a major expansion of the aviation company. He had invested millions into a new aircraft maintenance facility. He was proud, determined, focused. Friends said he was excited for the future, not defeated by business stress. But within the Millard household, tensions were rising. Wayne had reportedly restricted Dellen's access to company funds. He was frustrated by his son's lack of seriousness. And there were whispers, never confirmed, but repeated often enough that Wayne was preparing to limit Dellen's financial control. When prosecutors laid out their theory, it was simple and chilling. Wayne's death solved a problem for his son. It cleared a path to total control of the family empire, and it gave Dellen access to money he was rapidly burning through. The new analysis showed the original suicide conclusion had been too quick, too convenient, possibly even influenced by Dellen's calm insistence that his father had been depressed. Years of silence cracked open. What once appeared to be a tragic end to a struggling businessman was now being reframed as the opening act of a serial offender, one who had eliminated his own father before committing the murders that finally caught up with him. The case moved toward trial, and Dellen Millard, already serving life sentences, now faced another murder charge. Courtrooms watched closely as prosecutors described the staged scene, the placement of the firearm, the ballistic inconsistencies, the diary notes and business records showing Wayne's plans for the future. Not despair. They emphasized that Dellen benefited financially and strategically from his father's death. No explosive motive, no heated argument, just cold utility. It was one of the rare moments in Canadian legal history where a presumed suicide was revisited and legally reclassified as murder. And it became even more chilling given Dellen's known pattern eliminating people who stood in the way of his desires. The emotional kicker, Wayne Millard's life's work, his business, his legacy, his dream of building something his son could carry forward, ultimately became the motive for his own death. A father who reached for the sky was brought down not by failure or despair, but by the air he had spent his life trying to lift up. The courtroom was impossibly still when Dellen Millard entered, already wearing the weight of multiple life sentences. Gone was the polished heir who once moved through Toronto's social circles with effortless confidence. Now he was the man prosecutors called a patterned predator, someone whose charm masked a trail of violence that stretched back further than anyone realized. And this time, the accusation was the most intimate of all: killing his own father and staging it as suicide. At the center of the trial was a single, haunting question. Was Wayne Millard's death a personal collapse or a calculated erasure? Crown attorneys opened with what they called a cold ledger of motive. Wayne had been restructuring Millard Air, directing funds into a major new aviation facility. He was tightening budgets, limiting access, pressuring Dellen to prove he could handle responsibility. According to prosecutors, this tightening grip collided head-on with Dellen's hidden world: overspending, chaos, mounting debts, and a double life that required secrecy and money. The court heard from pathologists who re-examined the wound. They explained calmly, clinically, that the trajectory of the bullet did not match a self-inflicted shot. The angle was wrong. The gun placement was off. There were inconsistencies in residue patterns. It wasn't one anomaly, it was several, layered one over the other, forming a picture that was difficult to ignore. Experts emphasized that the original suicide conclusion had been reached quickly, without the scrutiny that later investigations applied. Then came the digital evidence. Phone pings, vehicle movements, gaps in Dellen's account on the night of his father's death. Crown attorneys walked jurors through a timeline that placed Dellen at the house when he claimed to be elsewhere. They highlighted messages revealing strain between father and son, frustration about money, conversations about responsibility, hints that Wayne was considering shutting Dellen out of certain business decisions. One witness described Wayne as exhausted but hopeful, trying to save a company he had built with decades of work. Another said Wayne believed his son was wasting opportunity after opportunity. For the Crown, this clash between a hard-working father and an entitled heir was critical. It painted a motive, rooted less in rage and more in cold calculation. The defense countered by attacking the reliability of the reinterpretation. They reminded the court that for years, every official involved had believed Wayne died by suicide. They noted that no one saw Dellen pull the trigger. They argued that reanalyzing a scene years later left room for doubt. The original firearm placement, they said, could have been disturbed during the initial investigation. And they underscored that Wayne had indeed been under stress, business expansion, financial pressure, the immense burden of running an aviation company. But the cumulative narrative was difficult to shake. The Crown stressed that Dellen's pattern of behavior, lying, staging, manipulating scenes, was consistent across his known crimes. They emphasized that the murder of his father occurred before the other killings, suggesting a progression that authorities had only recognized in hindsight. Prosecutors described it as the first act of a man who believed he could control every truth in his life, even death. When the verdict was read, it carried a quiet finality. The judge presiding alone without a jury found Dellen Millard guilty of first-degree murder. The reasoning was laid out clearly. Forensic evidence undermined the suicide theory. Digital records contradicted Dellen's account, and the financial and personal motive formed a credible narrative of premeditation. The sentence, another life term, stacked onto the ones he was already serving. In a moment that rippled across the courtroom, the judge stated bluntly that Wayne Millard did not take his own life. A declaration that rewrote the family's history and validated years of suspicion held by investigators who believed something had always been off about that quiet bedroom scene. The emotional kicker. As the ruling echoed through the room, the tragedy sharpened Wayne, a father who had spent his life building a company meant to secure his son's future, had been undone by the very future he was trying to shape. And Dellen, once the heir to an empire, now carried the lifelong burden of destroying not only strangers, not only friends, but the man who raised him. The photos came first: sunlit beaches, expensive hotels, smiling poses beside luxury cars. Friends thought Brian Blackwell was living the life most teenagers could only dream about. A tennis prodigy, a future millionaire, a young man headed for greatness. His girlfriend believed every word. Teachers admired his discipline. Even neighbors described him as polite, brilliant, destined for something extraordinary. No one knew the truth. The life Brian showcased was an illusion constructed on deceit, pressure, and a growing desperation to maintain a fantasy he could no longer afford to control. Inside the quiet Blackwell home in Merseyside, his parents Stephen and Jacqueline were the opposite of the glamorous life Brian claimed to have. They were hardworking, modest, and deeply supportive of their only child. They managed every bill, paid for every tennis lesson, sacrificed quietly so he could shine publicly. But behind their backs, Brian was forging signatures, creating fake bank statements, and telling increasingly elaborate stories to impress classmates and sustain the image he had built. Each lie required a larger lie. Each story demanded proof. As the pressure mounted, his parents began tightening boundaries. They questioned the spending. They challenged the fantasy. They noticed the forged applications and false claims about scholarships. And for a young man who viewed his invented persona as essential, almost sacred, their concern felt like a threat. Investigators later said the conflict inside the Blackwell household reached a breaking point in the summer of 2004, a private storm that no outsider ever saw coming. On the night Stephen and Jacqueline Blackwell were killed, neighbors heard nothing unusual: no screams, no struggles spilling into the street. The violence, according to prosecutors, unfolded inside the home in a swift and deliberate sequence. The reconstruction offered by forensic teams later described it in PG-13 language. A sudden attack, no defensive signs indicating they had any chance to react, and an immediate attempt by Brian to clean and organize the house afterward. The entire scene showed a chilling mix of panic and control. In the days that followed, Brian didn't retreat or break down. Instead, he escalated the fantasy. He booked luxury travel. He took his girlfriend on expensive trips, using his parents' money. He posed for photographs, dined at high-end restaurants, and acted as though nothing in his life had changed. Friends and acquaintances saw him as confident, carefree, drifting through summer as though he had stepped into adulthood effortlessly. But back in Merseyside, the Blackwell home stayed unnervingly still. Curtains unmoved, mail piling at the door. No sign of Stephen or Jacqueline anywhere. Neighbors grew uneasy. A welfare check was eventually requested. When officers entered the house, the silence inside told them everything. The search of the property led to a tragic discovery that immediately shifted Brian from promising scholar to prime suspect. Once the bodies were identified and the timeline reconstructed, detectives began retracing Brian's movements. Every receipt, every ATM withdrawal, every forged credit card record. Each one contradicted his initial claims. The glamorous life abroad was paid for with his parents' accounts. The luxurious dinners happened while their bodies lay undiscovered. His laughter in vacation photos existed parallel to a crime scene frozen in time. When police finally confronted him, Brian maintained his calm facade longer than most expected. But the weight of the evidence pressed in. His stories fractured. His contradictions multiplied. The polished student, the boy who hid stress behind a perfect smile, now faced a very different reality. The emotional kicker. It was the ultimate inversion of identity. A young man who spent years pretending to be extraordinary destroyed the two people who believed he already was. The fantasy he fought to protect outlived the parents who worked tirelessly to make his real life stable, loving, and enough. And in the end, the carefully curated image tennis star, high achiever, self-made prodigy, became the mask that revealed the monster beneath. The interview room was small, bright, and quiet. Quiet enough that every click of the detective's pen and every slow exhale seemed amplified. Brian Blackwell sat at the metal table with the same calm posture he used on tennis courts, chin high, hands folded neatly. But the illusion of control began to crack the moment detectives slid the first stack of documents across the table. Travel tickets, credit card statements, and forged signatures that dismantled his carefully curated double life, one page at a time. He had always been the boy who excelled, the prodigy, the young man with a scholarship on the horizon. But as officers spoke calmly about timelines that didn't make sense, purchase histories funded by accounts that no longer had owners, and the silent house where his parents' bodies had been found, Brian's facade shifted. Investigators later recalled how he tried to maintain the narrative, insisting he had been away, that he believed his parents were fine. But the records told a story he could no longer hide from. The deeper detectives went, the more disturbing the pattern became. Evidence showed months, if not years, of lies. Brian had forged bank statements to impress his girlfriend. He told coaches he had received international endorsements. He created an entire persona online, complete with fabricated accomplishments and plans. In reality, he had no such income, no sponsorships, no millionaire track. His parents' modest savings funded his growing appetite for luxury, and when they confronted him about spending and academics, the empire of falsehoods he'd built began to wobble. Psychiatrists later described his world as a fragile fantasy, one that required constant reinforcement and admiration. For someone with narcissistic tendencies, even gentle correction from his parents felt catastrophic. Their attempts to pull him back into reality were not just parental concerns. To Brian, they were threats to the identity he fought to maintain. That inner fracture became the prosecution's central theme. A son so consumed with image that he viewed the people who loved him most as obstacles. Legally, the case was complex. There was no dispute that Stephen and Jacqueline Blackwell had been killed inside their home. No question about the timeline Brian's holidays and high-end excursions happened after their deaths. But the question of why was where the courtroom divided. Instead of portraying Brian as a cold, methodical killer, defense attorneys introduced psychiatric evaluations that changed the tone of the trial. Experts diagnosed him with narcissistic personality disorder, describing him as detached from consequences, overwhelmed by pressure, and lost in a fantasy world he could no longer control. It was this diagnosis that shifted the legal framework. Though prosecutors pushed for murder convictions, the court ultimately accepted diminished responsibility. The killings, they argued, happened during an episode where Brian's grip on reality fractured under immense internal pressure. It didn't absolve him, far from it, but it reframed him not as a calculating predator, but as someone whose ego-driven collapse had catastrophic consequences. The sentence reflected that tension. Brian Blackwell received life imprisonment, with a minimum term, acknowledging both the brutality of the act and the psychiatric context surrounding it. British tabloids called the case a nightmare of the Facebook generation, warning of the dangers of image obsession in a digital age. They portrayed Brian as the boy who killed to protect a fantasy, a chilling symbol of a world where perception mattered more than truth. Outside the courtroom, public reaction remained split. Some saw him as manipulative, self-absorbed, and fully aware of his actions. Others viewed him as a young man crushed under the weight of expectations, both those placed on him and those he placed on himself. But for investigators, neighbors, and the extended Blackwell family, one truth overshadowed every interpretation. Stephen and Jacqueline were devoted parents who gave Brian stability, opportunity, and unconditional love. And those were the very things he destroyed. The emotional kicker. In the end, Brian stood not as the tennis star or the prodigy he wanted the world to believe he was, but as a son who exchanged real affection for invented notoriety. His parents built his foundation. He replaced it with a fantasy, and when they tried to pull him back to reality, he ensured they never would again. The welfare check was supposed to be routine, just a quick knock, a brief conversation, and officers would be back in their patrol car within minutes. But the moment police stepped into the modest Prince Albert home on the west side of the city, they felt the air shift. The house was silent, too silent, and the smell of something metallic hung faintly in the entryway. Officers called out names, expecting a family argument or a misunderstanding. But what they found instead was a scene that would traumatize an entire community. To understand how it came to this, you have to know who lived in that house. 66-year-old Denny Carrier and his wife Sandra were the kind of grandparents who filled the home with warmth, steady, reliable figures, raising their young grandchildren alongside their troubled son, Nathaniel. For years, the couple had been the stabilizing force in a house strained by mental health concerns, financial stress, and the emotional weight of Nathaniel's isolation. He had battled depression, withdrew from friends, spent long hours online, and increasingly talked about ending his life. Family members tried everything: interventions, conversations, emotional support, but his world had collapsed inward. By early 2020, things had taken a darker turn. Nathaniel grew fixated on an online relationship, withdrawing further from day-to-day responsibilities and reality. According to messages later recovered by police, he began framing his future in ominous terms. Not just self-destruction, but the idea of a family ending together. A phrase, investigators said, foreshadowed the catastrophic decision he would make. It wasn't rage, they concluded. It was a warped sense of escape, twisted into something unimaginably violent. The night it happened, the Carrier home was quiet. Nathaniel disabled the surveillance cameras around the house, a step prosecutors later said proved premeditation. The grandparents, unaware of the danger, settled into their usual evening routines. Nathaniel's young son was playing nearby. His daughter was heading to bed. What followed turned a loving household into a crime scene. In clinically safe PG-13 terms, investigators described how Nathaniel attacked his parents first swiftly, without warning before turning on his own children. His son died from the injuries. His daughter, despite being critically wounded, somehow survived. Tragically, the girl would later tell officers that her father knelt near her and whispered they were going to heaven together. Confirmation, police said that this was no sudden explosion of violence, but part of a suicide pact he believed included everyone in the home. Instead, she survived long enough to become the only voice left to describe the nightmare. When first responders entered the house after relatives couldn't reach the family, they found the little girl lying wounded but conscious. She was rushed to the hospital, placed into intensive care, and ultimately became the sole witness to the final moments of her grandparents and her brother. Officers, hardened by years of tragic calls, described the scene as one of the most haunting they had ever encountered. As detectives pieced together the story, the digital trail confirmed what they had feared. Nathaniel hadn't simply snapped. He had been planning it. Messages recovered from his devices spoke of wanting to end the pain, references to timelines, and even discussions of taking the children with him because he believed no one else could care for them. Prosecutors said this wasn't compassion, it was control taken to its fatal extreme. The community of Prince Albert, a city familiar with hardship but not this level of domestic devastation, was shaken. Vigils sprang up across the neighborhood, candles placed on sidewalks, children's drawings taped to telephone poles. Friends and relatives described Dennis and Sandra as pillars of support, people who stepped in when life became overwhelming for their son. Their deaths struck a particular chord because they had spent years trying to keep the family together, only to become victims of the very person they were trying to save. The surviving daughter, after multiple surgeries and intensive therapy, would eventually tell investigators everything she remembered. She spoke softly, haltingly, describing how her father told her he loved her before hurting her. Her testimony helped prosecutors build the full timeline and made the final moments of the victims painfully clear. The cliffhanger ending to this part comes when detectives, examining Nathaniel's final digital communications, discovered messages that spelled out the entire plan. Messages so deliberate, investigators said, they erased any possibility of spontaneous violence. In neatly typed text, he wrote about ending things tonight, making sure we go together, and leaving the world behind. It wasn't madness without direction. It was a plan written down, preserved, and carried out, one that only failed in its final step when his daughter survived to tell the truth. The courtroom was silent when the survivor's victim impact statement began. She was still a child, small, soft-spoken, visibly nervous, but when her words echoed across the packed gallery, they carried a weight no adult could have matched. She spoke about her grandparents' kindness, her little brother's laughter, and the moment she realized her father wasn't trying to protect her, he was trying to take her with him. Many in the room wept openly. Even veteran officers looked away, shaken. It was the emotional core of a case that prosecutors described as one of the most devastating family tragedies in Canadian history. From the moment charges were laid, the Crown built its case around digital evidence, text messages, internet searches, and journal entries that revealed a pre-planned suicide pact rooted in despair and distorted thinking. Nathaniel wasn't just overwhelmed, he was deliberate. In messages recovered from his phone, he spoke about wanting an end for everyone, worrying the children would be left alone, and describing a kind of merging of fates that investigators interpreted as his justification for murder. The Crown emphasized that he had disabled the home's cameras, prepared the environment, and taken steps that showed clarity, not confusion. Evidence technicians presented everything with clinical precision. The timestamps, the deleted messages recovered from backups, screenshots of his conversations about starting over in another place. They read out the chilling line that prosecutors said defined the case. "I can't leave them behind. They'll come with me." The words were quiet, technical, almost emotionless, but the meaning was unmistakable. The defense took a different path. They acknowledged the brutality of the acts, but focused on Nathaniel's mental state. They brought in psychiatric experts who described years of untreated depression, suicidal ideation, and a collapse into hopelessness during 2020, a year already marked by isolation and global instability. They explained how distorted thinking can narrow a person's world to one suffocating point until they begin viewing catastrophic choices as solutions. The defense insisted he didn't act out of cruelty, but delusion. But the Crown pushed back with a single, devastating argument. Nathaniel didn't choose death alone, he chose for everyone else. 2. They reminded the court that 3 people died. His elderly parents, who had raised him and supported him through countless emotional storms, and his young son, who should have been the safest person in his world. And then they returned to the survivor, the daughter, who lived precisely because she fought harder than anyone expected. Her survival, they argued, proved that she wanted to live. Her will to survive shattered any narrative that this was a family decision. When the judge addressed the court, his tone was steady, but heavy. He acknowledged Nathaniel's mental health issues, but he emphasized the seriousness of the crime. A triple murder and the attempted murder of a child. The facts were too overwhelming. The consequences too permanent. He outlined the legal requirements for sentencing, the mandatory life term, and the parole ineligibility period that reflected not just the number of victims, but also their vulnerability. Nathaniel Carrier was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum available under the law for this type of case. The judge called it a catastrophic betrayal of parental duty, and stated plainly that while mental illness explained parts of the tragedy, it did not excuse the deliberate steps taken before, during, and after the killings. Reactions rippled through Prince Albert in the days that followed. Community leaders spoke about the need for better mental health support. Teachers and neighbors talked about warning signs that, in hindsight, seemed obvious: withdrawal, fixation on dark themes, sudden talk of finality. But the grief overshadowed everything. Candles flickered at makeshift memorials. Strangers left stuffed animals and notes outside the home. The city mourned the grandparents, who had been described as generous and soft-spoken, always ready to help their son, even when he had nothing to give in return. Most haunting of all was the surviving daughter's testimony. She described the moment she realized her father was making a choice she didn't understand. She described crawling for help, fighting to stay alive, and waking up in a hospital bed with relatives holding her hand. Her words were read again at sentencing. "I still love my dad, but he hurt us. He hurt everyone. I wish he asked for help instead." It was a sentence that captured the entire tragedy, a mixture of innocence, betrayal, grief, and the impossibly complicated love children feel for their parents, even when those parents destroy their world. The emotional kicker of this part lands in the final image. A little girl standing between 2 futures, one defined by scars, and one shaped by the unimaginable strength it took for her to survive the night her father tried to take her with him. The Borlays' home sat tucked into the quiet mountains of Boone, North Carolina, a place where neighbors rarely locked their doors, where the loudest nightly sound was wind brushing through the trees. Inside that home lived a family that, to the outside world, seemed grounded in faith, discipline, and routine. Roger and Crystal Borlays were known as devoted parents. Their teenage son, Tristan, was polite, soft-spoken, and often described as reserved but respectful. No one imagined that the quiet tension building behind closed doors would erupt into one of the most shocking family murders the region had ever seen. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, Tristan's world had been tightening. Teachers noted slipping grades. Family friends mentioned he seemed more withdrawn, more anxious. And at home, the pressure kept rising. His parents, worried he was losing focus, had begun enforcing stricter rules, fewer privileges, more oversight, and consequences for failing assignments. According to investigators, an argument over school performance became the trigger point. Late on the evening of July 14th, 2019, Crystal and Roger confronted Tristan about another poor grade and removed his phone and car keys. What should have been an ordinary teenage punishment instead ignited a chain of violence that stunned an entire community. What happened next was reconstructed later in PG-13 detail by detectives and medical examiners. Inside the home, in a moment prosecutors later described as planned within anger, Tristan attacked his mother first. There were signs she tried to defend herself, that she may have pleaded with him. But the confrontation was swift and fatal. When Roger rushed in, likely hearing the struggle, he was attacked outside the house, where neighbors would later tell investigators they heard a single sharp noise before silence returned. The aftermath revealed just how quickly the situation escalated from a family dispute into a double homicide. Once both parents were dead, Tristan shifted from violence to concealment. Investigators say he attempted to clean the scene, moved items around the property, and tried to hide his parents' bodies in remote areas near the home. He then packed belongings and fled the state, driving through the night toward Tennessee in what authorities described as a desperate attempt to outrun the consequences. But in the age of digital footprints and interstate surveillance, his escape did not last long. As family members grew concerned when Roger and Crystal failed to report to work or return calls, a welfare check was requested. Deputies arrived at the Borlays' home and found signs of a struggle and no sign of the parents. An investigation launched immediately. Within hours, detectives pieced together Tristan's last known movements through security cameras and license plate readers. When a Tennessee trooper pulled his vehicle over the next day, Tristan was calm. He did not resist arrest. Back in North Carolina, the search for his parents turned into a recovery operation. Both were found in wooded areas near the property. The small mountain town that once felt peaceful now buzzed with disbelief. Pastors spoke about the unimaginable grief. Neighbors brought food to stunned relatives, and classmates struggled to reconcile the boy they knew with the crime he had committed. In court, prosecutors argued that the murders were not a flash of uncontrolled rage, but a deliberate response to parental discipline, a terrible choice made after a period of growing resentment and fantasy about breaking free from consequences. They presented forensic timelines, blood pattern analysis, and Tristan's own statements to show planning, not impulse. They noted that he attacked each parent separately, attempted to hide the bodies, and fled across state lines. The defense tried to raise questions about mental health, adolescent brain development, and the crushing weight of academic pressure. They argued that Tristan was overwhelmed, isolated, and spiraling further than anyone realized. They emphasized that he had no history of violence, no substance abuse, and had been described by multiple adults as a good kid under stress. But even these sympathetic angles could not overcome the brutality of what he had done. The jury deliberated for a short period before convicting him on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Though he was only 17 at the time, the court determined that the severity of the crime justified adult sentencing. Tristan Noah Borlays received life in prison without the possibility of parole, 2 consecutive life terms. A later appeal argued that sentencing a juvenile to life without parole was unconstitutional, but an appellate court upheld the decision, stating that the nature of the offense and the evidence of premeditation met the strict standards required for such a sentence. The emotional weight of the case lingered long after the verdict. The people who knew the Borlayses grappled with the senselessness of the loss. A devoted mother, a patient father, lives cut short by the son they raised with care. And with Tristan, there was no clear answer to the question that haunts every case like this. How does a teenage argument transform into irreversible catastrophe? In the end, the story of the Borlays murders became a chilling reminder that even inside quiet homes in peaceful towns, pressure, resentment, and emotional collapse can converge in ways no one expects. It is a profile defined by tragic miscalculations, shattered trust, and a future permanently split between the boy Tristan once was and the man he became, the moment he turned a family conflict into a double killing.